The light in a JCPenney has a particular quality, a fluorescent pallor that seems to exist outside of time, unchanging whether it's 1963 or 2015. Walk into any location, any decade, and that light greets you first, bouncing off linoleum floors polished to a dull shine, illuminating racks of clothing organized by size rather than aspiration, revealing a space designed for function rather than fantasy. It's the light of American pragmatism, the light that says we're here to sell you what you need, not what you dream about. The light that promises fair prices and honest value in a shopping experience defined by reliability rather than excitement. It's 1997, and somewhere in suburban America, a woman is standing in the women's department of her local JCPenney, holding a blouse in a color that the tag calls mauve, but that she would call purple, considering whether $29.99 is a reasonable price for something she doesn't love but needs for work. This is the promise of JCPenney, the promise that has sustained the company for over a century, the promise of the middle, of adequacy, of clothing and home goods that are good enough at prices that are fair enough for families who have neither the money for luxury nor the desperation that accepts true cheapness. At its peak, and peaks for companies like JCPenney are measured not in dramatic moments but in decades of steady presence. JCPenney wasn't just a department store. It was infrastructure, as fundamental to American commercial life as highways or telephone lines, a presence so constant and ubiquitous that it became invisible, the way essential things always do. Over 1,000 locations across the United States, anchoring shopping malls in every mid-sized city and suburb, providing not just merchandise but jobs, community gathering spaces, seasonal traditions, and a certain kind of middle-class identity that defined itself through brands like Stafford and St. John's Bay and Arizona Jeans. Annual revenues in the billions, a number that represented the aggregated clothing needs and home goods purchases of millions of American families who trusted JCPenney to provide what they needed at prices they could afford. The company was a pillar of American retail, founded in 1902 by James Cash Penney, with principles that sounded almost religious in their sincerity. Treating customers with respect, pricing goods fairly, building trust through consistency rather than gimmicks. But companies built on principles of fairness and consistency face a peculiar vulnerability in American capitalism. They can be sustained for decades, for generations even, as long as those principles align with market realities and consumer preferences and the structural economics of retail. But when the ground shifts, when the fundamental assumptions that made those principles viable begin to erode, when new competitors emerge with different models and different values and different relationships with debt and profitability, then principle becomes liability, consistency becomes rigidity, and the very things that made a company great become the things that doom it. JCPenney survived the Great Depression, survived the rise of discount retailers in the 1960s and 70s, survived the mall exodus of the 1990s, survived economic recessions and shifting fashion trends and technological disruptions that killed other retailers. But it couldn't survive the 2010s, couldn't survive the combination of e-commerce and fast fashion and private equity and leveraged buyouts and a catastrophic attempt at reinvention that destroyed whatever remained of customer trust and brand equity. This is the story of how JCPenney collapsed, how a company that had served American families for over a century, that had weathered every previous crisis, that had seemed as permanent as the malls it anchored, was brought to bankruptcy not by a single catastrophic error but by a series of decisions that each made sense individually, but combined to create an unstoppable trajectory toward failure. It's the story of what happens when retail companies become financial instruments, when quarterly earnings targets replace long-term strategy, when the pursuit of relevance leads to the abandonment of identity, when desperation creates the conditions for con men and consultants to experiment with other people's livelihoods. It's the story of Middle America losing one of the few remaining retailers that served it without condescension or exploitation, of workers losing jobs that once provided middle-class stability, of malls losing their anchors and communities losing their gathering spaces. Is a department store just a place to buy clothes, or is it part of the infrastructure that holds communities together? JCPenney's collapse forces us to answer that question. The origin story of JCPenney begins in 1902 in a small mining town called Kemmerer, Wyoming. Population about 400 souls living at the edge of the frontier, scraping by on whatever work the mines provided, shopping at company stores that charged inflated prices because there were no alternatives. James Cash Penney, the son of a Baptist minister, arrived in Kemmerer with a vision that seems almost impossibly idealistic in retrospect, almost naive in its faith that business could be conducted with genuine integrity. He opened a small store called the Golden Rule, named for a principle he actually believed in rather than just marketing copy, committed to treating customers with the same fairness and respect he would want for himself. He refused to bargain or haggle, posted fixed prices that were the same for everyone, sold only goods he believed in, treated customers like neighbors rather than marks to be exploited. In a mining town where workers were accustomed to being cheated by company stores that had captive markets and no incentive for fairness, the Golden Rule was revolutionary. The concept worked, not because Penney was some business genius with sophisticated strategies, but because he tapped into something fundamental about human nature and market dynamics that economists would later codify, but that he understood intuitively. People want to be treated fairly. They want to trust that they're getting good value, that they're not being exploited, that the merchant they're dealing with sees them as human beings rather than profit opportunities. When you provide that trust consistently, when you build a reputation for fairness that people can rely on, they reward you with loyalty and word of mouth and consistent business that sustains you through difficult times. The Golden Rule prospered and Penney opened more stores, eventually dropping the Golden Rule name in favor of JCPenney Company, but never dropping the principles that had made the first store successful. By 1920, there were 312 stores across 29 states. By 1930, there were 1,500 stores, making JCPenney one of the largest retail chains in America. Through the Depression, when other retailers failed and banks collapsed and the entire American economy seemed on the verge of collapse, JCPenney survived by staying true to those founding principles. They didn't raise prices to exploit desperate consumers. They didn't cut quality to maintain margins. They treated their workers with as much fairness as circumstances allowed, maintaining employment when other companies were laying off entire workforces. This wasn't just altruism, though Penney's religious convictions certainly played a role. It was also smart business, building customer loyalty and employee commitment that paid dividends when the economy recovered. After World War II, during the Great American Suburban Expansion, when shopping malls began replacing downtown shopping districts and families moved to subdivisions that needed new retail infrastructure, JCPenney was positioned perfectly to grow with America's middle class. They opened stores in the new malls, became anchor tenants that attracted other retailers, became part of the essential infrastructure of suburban American life. The JCPenney that emerged in the 1950s and 60s was not exciting or innovative or aspirational in the way that some retailers were. It didn't have Macy's theatrical window displays or Nordstrom's luxury positioning or Bloomingdale's cultural cachet. What it had was reliability, fairness, and a clear understanding of who it served. Middle America, families with kids and mortgages and aspirations that were modest but real. People who needed clothes for work and school and special occasions. people who wanted quality but couldn't afford luxury, people who appreciated being treated with respect rather than being sold to. The merchandise reflected this positioning. Private label brands like Stafford and Worthington that offered good quality at fair prices. Name brands like Levi's and Dockers that provided familiar quality. A selection that was neither cutting-edge fashion nor embarrassingly outdated, but rather solidly middle of the road in a way that served its customers well. The stores themselves embodied this same philosophy, functional rather than beautiful, organized for efficiency rather than experience, staffed by people who were genuinely helpful because they were trained to be and because the company culture valued service. Shopping at JCPenney was not an adventure or an entertainment experience. It was a chore made tolerable by fair prices and decent selection, and the confidence that you wouldn't be cheated or pressured or made to feel inadequate. For decades, this model worked beautifully, generating steady profits and providing stable employment and serving a large segment of American consumers who valued exactly what JCPenney provided. The company was profitable but not wildly profitable, grew steadily but not explosively, maintained market share without spending enormous amounts on marketing, existed in a kind of equilibrium that seemed sustainable indefinitely as long as the fundamental conditions of American retail remained stable. But fundamental conditions never remained stable indefinitely, and the 1980s and 90s brought changes that would eventually undermine JCPenney's business model, even if the full consequences wouldn't be felt for decades. Walmart emerged as a dominant force, offering lower prices than JCPenney could match by using scale and supply chain efficiency and a willingness to squeeze suppliers and workers in ways that JCPenney's principles wouldn't allow. Target positioned itself as a hipper, more design-conscious alternative to traditional department stores, attracting younger consumers who saw JCPenney as their parent store, outdated and uncool. Specialty retailers like Gap and Limited and later Old Navy and H&M fragmented the market, offering specific categories with more depth and fashion-forward merchandise than department stores could provide. Discount retailers like TJ Maxx and Ross began selling brand-name merchandise at prices that made JCPenney's regular prices seem high, even if JCPenney's everyday prices were actually fair by historical standards. The mall itself, the commercial ecosystem that JCPenney had helped build and that had sustained the company for decades, began a slow decline as consumer preferences shifted and e-commerce emerged as an alternative. Foot traffic decreased. The middle-class families that had been JCPenney's core customers faced stagnant wages and increasing economic pressure, had less disposable income for clothing and home goods, became more price-sensitive and more willing to chase deals rather than pay fair everyday prices. JCPenney responded to these pressures the way most established retailers do, with incremental adjustments that seemed reasonable individually, but collectively moved the company away from its founding principles and core identity. They introduced more sales and promotions to compete with discounters, training customers to wait for deals rather than pay everyday prices. They reduced investment in store maintenance and staffing, letting the in-store experience deteriorate slightly, imperceptibly, year after year. They chased trends, trying to be more fashionable and relevant, adding brands and styles that didn't quite fit the JCPenney identity. The company went through various ownership structures and management teams, each with their own vision for how to adapt to changing market conditions. The financial engineering began in earnest in 2004 when private equity firms came circling, seeing in JCPenney what they always see in stable but unexciting businesses: an opportunity to extract value through leverage and financial optimization. The company was taken private in a leveraged buyout, loaded with debt that would constrain its operational flexibility for years to come, setting in motion the financial dynamics that would eventually contribute to its bankruptcy. But the real catastrophe, the decision that would accelerate JCPenney's decline from slow erosion to rapid collapse, came in 2011 when the board of directors, desperate for transformation and willing to take dramatic risks, hired Ron Johnson as CEO. Ron Johnson came from Apple, where he had been credited with creating the spectacularly successful Apple Store concept, and before that from Target, where he had helped develop the cheap chic positioning that made Target cool. He was a retail rock star, a visionary, exactly the kind of bold, innovative thinker that JCPenney's board believed could transform their struggling company into something relevant and exciting. Johnson arrived with supreme confidence, with contempt for what JCPenney had been, with a vision for what it could become that was so clear and so compelling in his mind that he saw no need to test it before implementing it across the entire chain. He was going to eliminate the constant sales and promotions that had trained customers to never pay full price, return to fair and square everyday pricing, redesign the stores as collections of branded boutiques, transform JCPenney from a dowdy department store into a modern destination that would attract younger, hipper customers. The plan was called Fair and Square, and it sounds reasonable in the abstract, even admirable in its attempt to return to something like JCPenney's founding principles of fair pricing. But Johnson made a catastrophic error that reveals the difference between vision and understanding, between confidence and wisdom. He implemented his revolution immediately, across all stores, without testing, without phasing, without any of the normal precautions that retail executives take when making fundamental changes to a business model. He simply declared that the old way was over and the new way had begun, that JCPenney would no longer play the promotional game, that customers would learn to trust everyday low prices just as they had at Apple. Within months, it became clear that something had gone terribly wrong. Sales collapsed, not gradually but precipitously, falling by 25% in Johnson's first year. Customers who had been trained to wait for sales and promotions simply stopped coming when those sales disappeared. The everyday prices, even though they were often lower than the previous regular prices, seemed high because customers had been conditioned to evaluate value based on percentage discounts from inflated starting prices. The store redesigns, which Johnson had begun implementing at enormous cost, removing familiar fixtures and brands and replacing them with boutique concepts that felt alienating and confusing to JCPenney's core customers, accelerated the exodus. The customers who had shopped at JCPenney for decades felt betrayed, felt that the store they knew had been taken away from them, replaced by something that wasn't for them, that didn't want them, that was trying to attract some mythical younger, hipper customer who in reality had no interest in shopping at JCPenney regardless of how it was redesigned. Johnson had committed the cardinal sin of retail. He had alienated his existing customers in pursuit of customers who didn't exist, destroying real value in pursuit of imaginary value. The board, watching in horror as the company hemorrhaged cash and market share, fired Johnson after just 17 months, but the damage had been done. The customers who left didn't return. The brand equity that had been built over a century had been destroyed in a year and a half. The company was in crisis, burning through cash reserves, facing vendor and landlord concerns about its viability, struggling to survive let alone recover. The post-Johnson era was a long, slow attempt at recovery that never quite succeeded. A series of CEOs and strategies and initiatives that stabilized the bleeding but couldn't restore health, that kept JCPenney alive but never vibrant. They brought back the promotions and sales, trying to win back the customers who had left, but once trust is broken, it's extraordinarily difficult to rebuild. They closed underperforming stores, hundreds of them over the following years, each closure representing jobs lost and malls further weakened, and communities losing one more option for affordable clothing. They tried various strategies to compete with e-commerce, investing in online platforms and omni-channel capabilities, But they were years behind Amazon and Target and even Walmart, playing catch-up in a race where being behind meant being irrelevant. The debt load, accumulated through the earlier leveraged buyout and then increased to fund operations during the Johnson disaster, hung over everything, constraining investment and forcing decisions that prioritized short-term survival over long-term competitiveness. Throughout the 2010s, as JCPenney struggled, the broader retail landscape continued to evolve in ways that made traditional department stores increasingly obsolete. Fast fashion retailers like Zara and H&M offered trendy merchandise at low prices with rapid inventory turnover that made traditional retailers look stodgy and slow. Online retailers offered infinite selection and convenience that physical stores couldn't match. The middle class that had been JCPenney's customer base continued to hollow out, with families either moving up economically and shopping at higher-end retailers or moving down and shopping at Walmart and dollar stores, leaving fewer and fewer families in the middle market that JCPenney served. The malls where JCPenney stores were located continued their decline, with foot traffic decreasing year after year, with other anchor stores closing, with the entire mall ecosystem entering a death spiral that fed on itself. Behind the scenes in the corporate offices and distribution centers and stores themselves, the workers who made JCPenney function watched these changes with growing anxiety and resignation. The company had once been a good employer by retail standards, offering stable jobs with benefits and opportunities for advancement, treating workers with respect and investing in training. But as the financial pressures increased and the focus shifted to survival, labor became just another cost to minimize. Wages stagnated, benefits eroded. Hours became increasingly unpredictable as scheduling software optimized for efficiency rather than worker welfare. The longtime employees who remembered when JCPenney was a place you could build a career, who had invested years or decades in the company, watched as the culture changed, as the commitment to workers became subordinate to the demands of creditors and shareholders and consultants who saw labor as a line item on a spreadsheet rather than human beings with families and bills and dreams. The store-level workers, the sales associates and cashiers and stockroom employees who interacted with customers daily bore the brunt of the decline. They dealt with increasingly frustrated customers who blamed store employees for corporate decisions. They worked in stores that were understaffed and under-maintained, trying to provide service with inadequate resources. They watched as longtime colleagues were laid off or quit, as institutional knowledge evaporated, as the informal systems that make any retail operation work disappeared. They knew the company was failing, could feel it in the empty aisles and the desperate promotions and the vendors who were cutting back credit terms. But they had no power to change anything and often no better options for employment. For many, especially in smaller markets where JCPenney was one of the few retail employers, the job was all they had, and they held on to it even as it became clear the company was dying. The franchisees and concession operators, the smaller businesses that operated departments or specialty sections within JCPenney stores, faced their own crisis. Many had invested significant capital in fixtures and inventory, had built relationships with JCPenney customers over years, had created small businesses that depended entirely on foot traffic generated by the anchor store. As JCPenney declined, their businesses suffered, but they were locked into lease agreements and operational requirements that made it difficult or impossible to exit. Some tried to negotiate better terms or find alternative locations, but JCPenney's own financial distress left little room for accommodating partners. Many simply failed, losing their investments and their livelihoods, becoming collateral damage in JCPenney's collapse. The suppliers, particularly smaller manufacturers and brands that depended on JCPenney for significant portions of their revenue, watched nervously as the company's financial condition deteriorated. JCPenney stretched payment terms, demanding 90 or 120 days to pay invoices that had previously been paid in 30. They negotiated more favorable pricing using their market power, even as that power waned to extract concessions from suppliers who couldn't afford to lose the business. They reduced orders, creating problems for manufacturers who had built capacity and hired workers based on expected JCPenney volumes. The ripple effects extended through the supply chain, to factories and shipping companies and raw material suppliers, all connected by economic threads to JCPenney's fate. By 2019, JCPenney was clearly in terminal decline, implementing what retail analysts call a liquidation by degrees, slowly shrinking the business while trying to remain solvent, closing stores and laying off workers and reducing inventory commitments in a managed retreat that everyone understood was just delaying the inevitable. The debt load was unsustainable, approaching $4 billion for a company generating minimal profits in good quarters and losses in most quarters. The store fleet was too large and too costly to maintain, with hundreds of locations in dying malls generating negative cash flow. The brand was damaged beyond repair, associated in consumers' minds with outdated merchandise and disappointing experiences and the general failure that clings to companies everyone knows are dying. The competition had only gotten more intense, with Amazon continuing to gain market share and off-price retailers like TJ Maxx thriving, and even other struggling department stores like Macy's and Kohl's executing better than JCPenney. Then came 2020, and with it the pandemic that would accelerate retail trends that were already underway and kill companies that might have survived in normal times but had no reserves to weather a complete shutdown. On March 18, 2020, JCPenney closed all of its stores in response to pandemic lockdowns, sending home thousands of workers and cutting off the cash flow that was keeping the company alive. Unlike some retailers that had invested in robust e-commerce capabilities, JCPenney's online business was weak and unprofitable, unable to offset even a fraction of lost store sales. The company burned through its remaining cash reserves in weeks, unable to pay rent to landlords or payments to suppliers, facing a liquidity crisis that left no options beyond bankruptcy. On May 15, 2020, JCPenney filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection, listing assets and liabilities both between $1 billion and $10 billion. Though the real value of those assets was uncertain given that they consisted primarily of inventory that was increasingly unsellable and real estate leases that were liabilities as much as assets. The bankruptcy filing was not a surprise to anyone who had been paying attention. The surprise was that it had taken this long, that the company had managed to stumble forward for years after the Johnson disaster. That momentum and inertia and the complicated mechanics of retail bankruptcy had kept the doors open as long as they had. The filing laid bare the full scope of the catastrophe. $4 billion in debt, negative cash flow, negative equity, a business model that no longer worked and no clear path to making it work. The bankruptcy process was brutal in its efficiency, a mechanical carving up of what remained according to bankruptcy law priorities that gave secured creditors first claim and left unsecured creditors and workers fighting for scraps. Landlords formed committees to fight for rent payments and lease terms. Suppliers formed committees to recover what they were owed. Workers owed back pay and severance and accrued benefits joined their own committee but knew they were last in line. That in bankruptcy, the people who actually did the work are considered less important than the institutions that provided capital. The bankruptcy judge oversaw the process with the cold precision of someone who has done this many times, someone who understands that bankruptcy is mathematics, not morality, that the law provides clear rules about who gets paid in what order regardless of who deserves what. Through the bankruptcy, JCPenney continued operating its stores in a surreal zombie state, selling merchandise to customers who wondered if gift cards would be honored and if returns would be accepted, staffed by workers who didn't know if they'd have jobs next month, supplied by vendors who shipped product while hoping they'd eventually be paid something. The company tried to project confidence to assure customers and workers and partners that this was just a restructuring, that JCPenney would emerge stronger and more competitive, that the bankruptcy was eliminating debt and closing underperforming stores and positioning the company for success. But everyone involved understood the reality. This was managed decline, an orderly liquidation of a company that had outlived its business model, a process designed to maximize creditor recovery while pretending to save the business. The bankruptcy plan that eventually emerged involved closing over 200 stores, laying off thousands of workers, and selling the company to a consortium of mall operators Simon Property Group and Brookfield Asset Management for $300 million, plus assumed liabilities. The mall operators weren't buying JCPenney because they believed in its future as a retailer. They were buying it because they needed anchors for their malls, because losing JCPenney would trigger co-tenancy clauses that would allow other stores to break leases or reduce rent, because an empty JCPenney created a visual signal of failure that accelerated mall decline. They were buying time, keeping the doors open long enough to figure out what to do with the real estate and maybe avoid the immediate collapse of their mall properties. The workers who lost their jobs in the bankruptcy closures, over 15,000 people, faced a labor market devastated by pandemic unemployment and an economy that was eliminating exactly the kind of retail jobs they were qualified for. Many had worked at JCPenney for years or decades, had developed skills and expertise that were valuable in traditional retail but increasingly obsolete in an e-commerce-dominated market. Many were older workers who had faced discrimination in trying to find new employment, who had planned to work another 10 or 15 years at JCPenney before retirement, and now had to figure out how to survive with decimated savings and dim employment prospects. Many were in smaller communities where JCPenney had been one of the few decent employers, where losing this job meant accepting something significantly worse or leaving town entirely to find work elsewhere. The stores that closed left behind empty spaces in malls that were already struggling, accelerating the death spiral that characterizes American retail real estate. In many communities, JCPenney had been not just a store but a gathering place, particularly for older Americans who used mall walking as exercise and socialization. The closure meant losing a landmark, a point of reference, a place that had been part of community life for decades. It meant fewer options for affordable clothing in communities that often had limited retail choices. It meant less traffic for other mall stores, creating pressure on those businesses and starting the cycle that leads to more closures and eventually to dead malls that sit empty or get converted to other uses or demolished entirely. The JCPenney that emerged from bankruptcy in December 2020 was a diminished entity, operating about 650 stores compared to over 1,000 before bankruptcy, carrying about $500 million in debt compared to $4 billion before, but still lacking any clear competitive advantage or path to profitability. The new owners implemented various strategies to try to make the business viable, investing in e-commerce, modernizing some stores, introducing new brands and concepts, partnering with online retailers for shop-in-shop arrangements. But these were tactics without strategy, attempts to paper over fundamental problems. The customers who had abandoned JCPenney over the previous decade didn't suddenly return because ownership changed. The competitive pressures that had made the business model obsolete didn't disappear because debt was reduced. The cultural irrelevance that had made JCPenney a punchline didn't reverse because of some store renovations. The essential problem was that JCPenney no longer had a clear reason to exist. In retail, you need to be the best at something, the preferred choice for some segment of customers for some specific reason. You need to be the cheapest or the highest quality or the most convenient or the best selection or the most fashionable or the best service or something. JCPenney in the 2020s wasn't the best at anything. It wasn't the cheapest because Walmart and Amazon and off-price retailers beat them on price. It wasn't the highest quality because customers who wanted quality went to Nordstrom or shopped online for specific brands. It wasn't the most convenient because e-commerce was more convenient than going to a mall. It wasn't the best selection because specialty retailers and online had more depth. It wasn't the most fashionable because fast fashion retailers and online brands were faster and trendier. It wasn't the best service because staffing cuts had degraded the in-store experience to the point where service was minimal at best. What JCPenney had been, what had sustained it for over a century, was fairness and reliability and trustworthiness for Middle America. But fairness and reliability and trustworthiness, while valuable, aren't enough when customers have unlimited alternatives and when the company's actions over many years have destroyed the trust that once existed. The Ron Johnson disaster destroyed trust by telling customers they weren't wanted anymore. The decades of declining quality and increasing promotionalization destroyed trust by training customers that advertised prices were meaningless. The bankruptcy destroyed trust by confirming what everyone suspected, that the company was failing and unstable. You can't rebuild that kind of fundamental trust with marketing campaigns and store renovations and new product lines. Trust takes generations to build and moments to destroy, and once it's gone, it rarely comes back. The story of JCPenney's collapse is often framed as a story about e-commerce disruption, about Amazon killing traditional retail, about inevitable technological change that some companies adapted to and others didn't. And there's truth in that framing. E-commerce did fundamentally reshape retail, did create competitive pressures that traditional retailers struggled to match, did accelerate trends that were already underway. But that's not the whole story, not even the most important part. JCPenney didn't fail primarily because of Amazon. It failed because of a series of specific decisions made by specific people who prioritized short-term extraction over long-term sustainability, who leveraged the company to unsustainable levels, who hired a CEO who destroyed the brand in pursuit of an impossible vision, who responded to decline with cost-cutting that made the decline worse, who treated workers and suppliers and customers as disposable in pursuit of financial metrics that satisfied creditors and shareholders but destroyed operational capacity. Consider what JCPenney might have been if different choices had been made at critical junctures. If the company had not been taken private and loaded with debt, it might have had the financial flexibility to invest in e-commerce and store modernization earlier and more aggressively. If the board had not hired Ron Johnson, or if having hired him they had insisted he test his theories before implementing them across the chain, the company might have avoided the catastrophic loss of customers and revenue. If management had focused on serving their existing customers exceptionally well, rather than chasing demographic segments that didn't want them, they might have maintained a loyal base that sustained the business through difficult transitions. If they had invested in workers and store experience rather than cutting costs to satisfy financial engineers, they might have maintained the service quality that had once differentiated them. If they had acknowledged earlier that their store fleet was too large and reduced it strategically over years rather than in crisis, they might have strengthened remaining stores rather than spreading resources too thin. None of these counterfactuals guarantees success. The structural changes in retail were real and powerful, and many traditional retailers failed despite making reasonable decisions. But the specific way JCPenney failed, the catastrophic collapse rather than managed decline, the bankruptcy rather than transformation, the destruction of 118 years of brand equity, that was not inevitable. That was the result of specific choices that could have been made differently by people who had the power to choose but chose poorly. The workers who lost their jobs, over 50,000 across the years of decline if you count all the closures and layoffs leading up to and during bankruptcy, bore no responsibility for these choices but paid the highest price. The communities that lost their JCPenney stores and the economic activity and employment and social infrastructure they represented bore no responsibility, but absorbed the costs. The customers who lost a retailer that, whatever its flaws, had served them reasonably well for generations, bore no responsibility but had fewer options. The suppliers who manufactured goods for JCPenney, who invested in capacity and hired workers based on expected orders, who extended credit and shipped product in good faith, bore no responsibility but lost money and sometimes failed entirely when JCPenney couldn't pay. The economic ripples from JCPenney's collapse extended far beyond the company itself, touching everyone connected to it through the complex web of relationships that characterizes modern capitalism. This is what makes corporate failure a public concern, rather than just a private business matter. When companies as large and interconnected as JCPenney fail, they take pieces of the economy and the social fabric with them, destroying value and opportunity and stability in ways that can't be recovered by simply starting new businesses or finding new jobs. The malls where JCPenney closed stores face existential questions about their own survival. Department stores anchor malls, generate the foot traffic that makes other stores viable, provide the variety and scale that justifies driving to the mall rather than shopping elsewhere. When one anchor closes, it weakens the entire ecosystem. When multiple anchors close, which has been happening at accelerating rates, the mall enters a death spiral where declining traffic leads to more closures, leads to further declining traffic until nothing remains but empty buildings and parking lots. Some malls have been redeveloped for other uses, converted to distribution centers or office space or housing, or even torn down entirely. Some remain empty, monuments to a particular era of American commercial architecture and consumer behavior, visible evidence of economic transformation and loss. The communities that lose their malls lose more than just shopping options. They lose gathering spaces, particularly important for older residents and teenagers who used malls as climate-controlled public spaces. They lose tax revenue from sales taxes and property taxes, creating fiscal stress that forces cuts to public services. They lose the jobs and economic activity that malls generated, from the retail workers to the service workers to the suppliers and contractors that service the facilities. They lose landmarks and orientation points, the place where people met and memories were made. In smaller communities where the mall might have been the primary retail center, the loss is even more profound, potentially leaving no alternatives for miles. This is the hidden cost of retail transformation, the social and economic infrastructure that disappears along with the stores, the ways that commercial decisions with clear business logic create public costs that no one accounts for or compensates. James Cash Penney, who founded the company in 1902 with principles he actually believed in, died in 1971. Long before the decline began, before the decisions were made that would ultimately destroy what he built. He never saw the Ron Johnson disaster or the bankruptcy or the slow managed decline that followed. He never had to watch as principles that had sustained the company for nearly a century were abandoned in pursuit of relevance and profit. Perhaps that's a mercy. Building something over a lifetime and watching it destroyed in years is its own particular tragedy. But his legacy deserves examination not as a success story because ultimately JCPenney failed, but as a case study in how institutions built on solid principles can be destroyed when those principles are subordinated to short-term financial engineering, and when the people in charge prioritize extraction over stewardship. The question JCPenney's collapse poses is whether traditional retail serving Middle America has any future at all, or whether the combination of the e-commerce and fast fashion and economic polarization has made that business model permanently obsolete. The answer matters because it determines whether tens of millions of Americans who don't want to or can't shop primarily online who value being able to see and touch and try on merchandise, who appreciate having local options for returns and exchanges and service, will have those options going forward. Walmart serves a lower price point. Nordstrom and other luxury retailers serve a higher point. Target has found some success in the middle, but even Target has struggled in closed stores and faces its own challenges. The middle of the market, where most Americans actually live, is increasingly underserved by physical retail, creating a kind of commercial desert that has social and economic consequences beyond simply where people buy clothes. The JCPenney that exists today, operating in bankruptcy emergence under mall operator ownership, is a shadow of what the company once was, and everyone involved understands it's likely temporary, a delay rather than a solution, keeping the doors open until the mall operators figure out their own endgames, or until market conditions make continued operation impossible. The workers still employed know their jobs are precarious, that another round of closures could come at any time, that loyalty to the company won't be reciprocated if the numbers don't work. The customers who still shop there do so out of habit or necessity or lack of alternatives, not enthusiasm. The whole enterprise has the feeling of an epilogue, a gradual unwinding of something that was important but is no longer sustainable, a managed retreat toward an end that everyone can see but no one wants to acknowledge. In empty JCPenney locations across America, you can still sometimes see the traces of what was. The brackets on walls where fixtures hung, the patterns on floors where foot traffic wore paths between departments, the abandoned signage and promotional materials. These spaces tell a story about American retail and American life, about how we used to shop and gather and build communities, about what we've lost in the transformation to e-commerce, and about what we've gained and about whether the trade-offs were worth it. They're not dramatic ruins in the way abandoned factories or hospitals are dramatic. They're just empty retail boxes already being repurposed or sitting vacant, forgettable spaces that were never beautiful to begin with. But they represent something real about American economic and social life, about how we organize commerce and employment and community, about what happens when business models that sustained millions of workers and served hundreds of millions of customers become obsolete. The collapse of JCPenney is not a tragedy in the classical sense, not a fall from grace of a noble enterprise brought low by fate or hubris. It's something more mundane and more disturbing, the slow managed decline of an institution that once served an important function but that became a vehicle for financial extraction, and then was discarded when the extraction was complete. The beneficiaries were the private equity firms and the executives who collected their fees and compensation during the good years, and the creditors who recovered some percentage of their loans in bankruptcy. The victims were the workers who lost jobs and customers who lost options and communities that lost anchors and all the suppliers and partners and related businesses that depended on JCPenney's continued operation. This is the arithmetic of modern capitalism, efficient in allocating losses to those least able to bear them, effective at protecting those with capital and power while exposing everyone else to the full consequences of business failure. What remains in the wake of JCPenney's collapse is a question about what we value and what we're willing to accept. Do we accept an economic system that allows financial engineering to destroy century-old institutions that serve important functions? Do we accept that workers can dedicate careers to companies that will discard them without hesitation when financial conditions change? Do we accept that communities can lose essential infrastructure with no recourse or compensation? Or do we demand something different, some framework that balances the creative destruction of capitalism with protection for the people and places that bear the costs of that destruction? JCPenney's bankruptcy offers no answers, only evidence, a data point in the larger pattern of American retail collapse and economic transformation. But the questions it raises demand answers we're not yet ready to give. The story of how Ron Johnson destroyed JCPenney in 17 months deserves deeper examination because it reveals something profound about the nature of retail and customer relationships, and the danger of importing strategies from one context to another without understanding what makes each context unique. Johnson came from Apple, where he had overseen the creation of the Apple Store concept, which was genuinely revolutionary and enormously successful. The Apple stores eliminated commissioned salespeople, created open layouts with products people could touch and explore, located in high-traffic areas, and built an experience around the brand that transcended mere transactions. It worked beautifully for Apple because Apple sold products that people actively wanted, that had strong brand loyalty, that commanded premium prices, that were differentiated enough that customers couldn't easily find substitutes. The Apple Store experience enhanced the already desirable product, made the act of buying an Apple product feel special and considered and worth the premium price. Johnson looked at JCPenney and saw an opportunity to apply the same principles, to transform a dowdy department store into a destination where people would want to spend time, where the experience itself would become a reason to shop. He imagined boutiques within the store, each dedicated to a specific brand or category with distinctive design and merchandising that would make browsing more interesting than walking past racks of similar-looking clothes. He imagined eliminating the constant sales and promotions that cluttered the store with signage and trained customers to wait for discounts, replacing them with honest everyday pricing that customers could trust. He imagined transforming JCPenney from a place you went because you needed something into a place you wanted to go because it was interesting and enjoyable. It was a compelling vision, the kind that boards and investors love because it promises transformation rather than incremental improvement, because it offers a clear narrative about disruption and innovation. But Johnson fundamentally misunderstood the difference between Apple customers and JCPenney customers, between products people desire and products people need, between premium pricing and value pricing, between transformation that enhances what already works and transformation that destroys it. JCPenney customers didn't come to the store because they loved the JCPenney brand or because they found shopping there particularly enjoyable. They came because they needed clothes for work or school, because they needed towels or sheets or kitchen items, because JCPenney offered adequate quality at prices they could afford, because they knew what to expect and could trust they wouldn't be cheated. The sales and promotions that Johnson found distasteful were not a bug in the system, but a feature. Not something that alienated customers, but something they expected and valued. A game they had learned to play where they felt smart for waiting for sales and getting good deals. When Johnson eliminated sales and installed his everyday fair pricing, he didn't just change the economics of shopping at JCPenney, he changed the psychology. Customers who had felt smart for getting things on sale now felt confused and suspicious, wondering if the new prices were actually fair or if they were being tricked somehow. The promotional calendar that had structured their shopping behavior, the Memorial Day sales and back-to-school sales and Black Friday sales, suddenly disappeared, leaving them without the cues that told them when to shop and what constituted a good deal. The store redesigns, which replaced familiar departments with boutique concepts, made navigation confusing and shopping frustrating for people who wanted to quickly find what they needed rather than explore and discover. Johnson had taken away everything that made JCPenney work for its customers and replaced it with something that might have worked for a different customer base, but absolutely didn't work for the people who actually shopped there. The speed with which he implemented these changes made recovery impossible. If he had tested the concept in a few stores, the failure would have been contained and reversible. If he had phased the changes gradually, giving customers time to adjust and providing opportunity for mid-course corrections, the damage might have been limited. But Johnson was so confident in his vision, so certain that he understood retail better than the people who had spent careers at JCPenney, that he rolled out his revolution system-wide immediately. When sales began collapsing, when it became obvious that customers were rejecting the changes wholesale, he doubled down rather than reversing course, insisting that customers would learn to appreciate the new JCPenney once they understood it, that the initial resistance was just unfamiliarity that would fade with time. He was wrong, catastrophically wrong, and by the time the board forced him out, the company had lost billions in revenue and millions of customers who never returned. The workers at JCPenney during the Johnson era experienced the disaster from the inside, watching in real time as decisions made in corporate offices in Texas destroyed the business they depended on. They saw foot traffic decline week after week as customers stopped coming, saw the confused and angry reactions when shoppers discovered that the sales and promotions they expected were gone, saw the frustration when customers couldn't find what they were looking for because familiar departments had been reconfigured into boutiques. They tried to explain to customers what was happening, tried to make the best of an impossible situation, tried to maintain service and professionalism even as it became increasingly clear that the company was in crisis. Many left for other jobs, unwilling to stay on a sinking ship, unwilling to endure the stress of working for a company that was so obviously failing. Those who stayed did so because they needed the paycheck, because they hoped things would get better, because they had invested too much to walk away easily. The vendors and suppliers who had relationships with JCPenney going back decades watched the Johnson disaster with a mixture of horror and helplessness. They had inventory in the pipeline, orders that had been placed months earlier based on historical sales patterns, merchandise that arrived at stores that were now seeing 50% declines in traffic. They couldn't pull their products because contracts bound them, couldn't stop shipping because that would trigger penalties, couldn't do anything except watch as their goods sat unsold while JCPenney hemorrhaged cash, and their own accounts receivable grew larger and more concerning. Some demanded better terms, requiring cash on delivery or significantly shortened payment windows, which put additional stress on JCPenney's already strained finances. Others simply stopped shipping, deciding that the risk of non-payment exceeded the potential benefits of maintaining the relationship, leaving holes in JCPenney's merchandise assortment that made the stores even less appealing to customers. The post-Johnson recovery attempt, led by Mike Ullman, who had been CEO before Johnson and was brought back to clean up the mess, faced impossible odds. The customers who had left were shopping elsewhere now, had found alternatives at Target or Kohl's or online, had broken the habit of going to JCPenney for their basic needs. Bringing them back required not just reversing Johnson's changes but rebuilding trust that had been shattered, convincing people that JCPenney understood them again, that the store was for them again, that it wouldn't abandon them again for some consultant's vision of what retail should be. Ullman brought back the sales and promotions, brought back familiar brands and departments, tried to recreate what had worked before Johnson. But you can't simply reverse time, can't undo damage that has been done, can't resurrect relationships that have died. The sales came back but rang hollow, felt desperate rather than strategic, trained customers, that JCPenney was in trouble and might not survive and therefore wasn't a safe place to develop loyalty. The financial damage was even harder to repair than the customer relationships. Johnson had spent hundreds of millions on store redesigns that now had to be undone, money that was simply wasted, capital that could have been invested in e-commerce or supply chain or worker wages or any number of things that might have actually improved competitiveness. The company had burned through cash reserves during the sales collapse, had taken on additional debt to fund operations, had weakened relationships with vendors and landlords, who now saw JCPenney as a credit risk. The debt load that had been manageable when the business was generating consistent cash flow became crushing when cash flow turned negative, creating a vicious cycle where the company had to focus on survival rather than investment, on cutting costs rather than improving the business, on managing decline rather than building for the future. Throughout the mid and late 2010s, JCPenney tried various strategies to find a path forward, to identify some sustainable business model that could work in the new retail environment. They invested in their e-commerce platform, trying to match competitors who had decade-long head starts and vastly more resources. They introduced new brands and exclusive partnerships, trying to offer merchandise that couldn't be found elsewhere. They tested smaller format stores for strip centers and lifestyle centers, trying to reduce dependence on dying malls. They brought in new executives with fresh perspectives, tried new marketing campaigns, experimented with different promotional strategies and pricing structures. None of it worked, not because the strategies were necessarily wrong, but because the fundamental problem was unsolvable within the constraints JCPenney faced. The fundamental problem was that JCPenney no longer had a viable economic model. The costs of operating physical stores, particularly the large format department stores and malls that JCPenney specialized in, required sales volumes that were increasingly difficult to achieve in an era where customers had shifted massively to online shopping. The margins on the merchandise JCPenney sold, basic clothing and home goods in competitive categories, were thin and getting thinner as online retailers and off-price stores drove prices down. The debt service on the billions JCPenney owed consumed cash that might have been invested in making the business more competitive. The competition was too intense, too well-funded, too entrenched for JCPenney to displace or match. Amazon had infinite selection and superior convenience. Walmart had lower prices and better supply chain efficiency. Target had better brand perception and more successful store experience. TJ Maxx and Ross had access to the same brands at lower prices. Every direction JCPenney might have moved, there was a competitor who was already stronger in that space. The workers remaining at JCPenney through these years of managed decline developed a particular kind of fatalism, understanding that the company was failing but showing up for shifts anyway because they needed the money. And because sometimes momentum and duty and habit are stronger than rational calculation of prospects. They watched as stores closed, as colleagues were laid off, as the company tried and abandoned one strategy after another, as management changed and new executives arrived with their own versions of the same basic plan to cut costs and improve sales and somehow find a way forward. They knew, most of them, that it was hopeless, that the company was dying slowly rather than quickly, but dying nonetheless. Some left when they could, finding jobs at competitors or in different industries, escaping before the final collapse. Others stayed because they were too old to start over, because they had seniority and benefits that would be lost if they quit, because they hoped that somehow things would stabilize or that they could make it to retirement before the end came. The customers who remained loyal to JCPenney through the decline were disproportionately older, disproportionately from smaller communities with limited retail options, disproportionately uncomfortable with online shopping or unable to access it effectively. They continued shopping at JCPenney not because it was great, but because it was adequate and familiar, because they knew where things were and how the store worked. Because the alternatives were worse or more stressful or required technology they didn't possess. These loyal customers deserved better than they got, deserved a company that invested in serving them well rather than one that was managed for survival, deserved stores that were well-maintained and well-stocked rather than sad, depleted spaces with bare racks and burned-out lights and floors that hadn't been properly cleaned in months. But resources were limited and priorities were elsewhere, focused on creditors and landlords and the corporate functions necessary to keep operating rather than on the customer experience that might have justified continued operation. The malls where JCPenney stores were located watched the company's decline with existential dread because they understood that losing a major anchor store would accelerate their own decline, would trigger co-tenancy clauses in vacancy and reduced foot traffic that could push them past the point of viability. Mall operators tried to work with JCPenney, offering rent reductions and lease modifications and support for remodeling, anything to keep the stores open and the anchor space occupied. But there were limits to how much support they could provide while maintaining their own financial viability. And ultimately, they couldn't solve JCPenney's fundamental problems, couldn't make the economics work when the business model was broken. When stores finally closed, mall operators scrambled to find replacement tenants. But replacing a 100,000 square foot anchor store is nearly impossible when retail real estate is in general decline, when other department stores are closing stores rather than opening them, when the market for large retail spaces has collapsed. The pandemic, when it came in early 2020, was not the cause of JCPenney's bankruptcy, but it was the trigger. The event that made bankruptcy unavoidable by cutting off the cash flow that was barely keeping the company alive. The store closures in March eliminated essentially all revenue while fixed costs continued, burning through cash reserves in weeks rather than months, creating an immediate liquidity crisis that left no options beyond bankruptcy. Some retailers used the pandemic as an opportunity to restructure and emerged stronger. But JCPenney had no strength to build on, no hidden reserves of efficiency or competitiveness that could be unlocked. Through bankruptcy, no vision for what a successful post-pandemic JCPenney might look like. The bankruptcy was just an acknowledgement of what had been true for years, that the company was already dead and had been operating on momentum and denial, and the complicated mechanics of retail operations that allow zombie companies to continue functioning long after they've lost any real viability. The bankruptcy process revealed the full extent of the financial carnage. $4 billion in debt against a business generating minimal EBITDA and usually operating losses. Over 800 stores, most of them in declining malls or other problematic locations, many generating negative cash flow. Inventory that had to be heavily discounted to sell, reflecting both the general decline in foot traffic and the specific problems with merchandise selection and quality. Real estate leases that were liabilities rather than assets. Obligations that exceeded the value the stores generated. The bankruptcy judge oversaw the familiar process of creditor committees forming and fighting over what remained. Lawyers billing enormous hours to argue over who got paid in what order. Consulting firms collecting fees to analyze a situation that was obvious to anyone paying attention. A whole ecosystem of bankruptcy professionals extracting value from the corpse of a company that had once employed over 100,000 people. The 200 store closures announced during bankruptcy were presented as necessary right-sizing, as eliminating underperforming locations to make the remaining fleet stronger. But every closed store represented dozens of jobs lost, a community losing retail access, a mall losing an anchor and moving closer to its own collapse. The workers who were laid off in these closures joined the tens of thousands who had already been let go in previous rounds, competing in a job market that was devastated by pandemic unemployment and that had little demand for the skills that retail workers possessed. Many never found comparable employment, ended up in gig economy jobs or service positions that paid less and offered no benefits or security, watched their standard of living decline because JCPenney's collapse coincided with broader economic transformation that eliminated exactly the kind of middle-class retail employment that had sustained millions of American families. The sale to Simon Property Group and Brookfield Asset Management for $300 million represented an extraordinary destruction of value, a company that had been worth billions now being sold for a fraction of that. A century-old brand being acquired essentially for the real estate value and the short-term benefit to mall operators of keeping the space occupied. The new owners had no particular expertise in retail, no vision for making JCPenney successful as a merchandising operation, no interest in JCPenney beyond what it could do for their mall properties. They were buying time, delaying the moment when they would have to figure out what to do with large empty anchor spaces, hoping that somehow retail conditions would improve, or that they could find alternative uses for the space, or that they could at least avoid the immediate crisis of dark anchors triggering mall death spirals. The workers and suppliers and communities affected by JCPenney's collapse had no voice in this transaction, no representation in the negotiations, no consideration of their interest beyond what bankruptcy law required, which was essentially nothing. The JCPenney that emerged from bankruptcy in December 2020 was a shell, operating roughly 650 stores with a reduced workforce and diminished vendor relationships, and a brand that had been so damaged it was barely recognizable. The promise to invest in the business and modernize stores and create a viable long-term enterprise rang hollow to anyone who had watched retail bankruptcy emerge before, who understood that the new owner's incentives were not aligned with building a successful retail operation, but rather with maximizing value from real estate assets while those assets still had value. The workers who kept their jobs understood they were expendable, that another round of closures would come whenever the economics dictated, that loyalty to the company was foolish because the company had no loyalty to them. The customers who continued shopping there did so with diminishing enthusiasm, with the sense that they were shopping at a store that was failing slowly rather than quickly, but definitely failing. In the years since bankruptcy, JCPenney has continued operating in this diminished state, announcing periodic store closures and management changes and new strategies that generate headlines but little actual change in trajectory. The company announced plans to go private again, to be taken over by new investors, to implement new retail concepts, to partner with various brands and companies. But none of these announcements have translated into observable improvement in the business or reasons to believe that JCPenney has found a sustainable path forward. The stores that remain are often sad spaces, understocked and undermaintained, staffed by skeleton crews that can't provide adequate service, frequented by customers who have few better options or who shop out of habit rather than preference. It's retail purgatory, existence without purpose, operations without viability. The slow death that comes when bankruptcy eliminates debt but doesn't solve fundamental problems. The communities that have lost JCPenney stores continue to deal with the aftermath. Some have seen the spaces redeveloped for other uses, though large anchor spaces are difficult to repurpose and often sit empty for years. Some have seen malls collapse entirely after losing anchors, leading to complete redevelopment of the sites for housing or mixed use, or simply demolition and return to empty land. The job losses have never been recovered, especially in smaller communities where JCPenney was a significant employer and where retail jobs in general have been declining. The tax base erosion has forced budget cuts and service reductions, making communities less attractive and accelerating decline in a self-reinforcing spiral. These are the hidden costs of retail transformation that show up nowhere in bankruptcy filings or corporate financial statements, but that accumulate in communities across America. The suppliers and manufacturers who depended on JCPenney for significant business have had to adapt or fail, have had to find other customers or reduce capacity or simply close operations that were no longer viable without the JCPenney orders. The apparel industry has been hollowed out by the collapse of department stores, with fewer and fewer retailers purchasing domestic or near-domestic production, with more production moving to lowest-cost offshore sources, with quality declining across the industry as pressure on prices intensifies. JCPenney was far from the only department store to fail, but each failure added to the pressure, made the industry less viable, eliminated another channel through which American-made or responsibly made merchandise could reach consumers. The result is an apparel industry that is increasingly dominated by fast fashion produced in questionable conditions overseas, sold through channels that prioritize low prices over any other consideration. The question of what could have been done differently, what decisions might have saved JCPenney, or at least enabled a more graceful decline, has no satisfying answers. The structural forces transforming retail were powerful and would have challenged any traditional department store. But the specific decisions that accelerated JCPenney's collapse were not inevitable. The leveraged buyout that loaded the company with debt was a choice made by specific people who prioritized financial engineering over operational strength. The hiring of Ron Johnson was a choice made by a board that prioritized transformation over understanding, that was seduced by vision without considering risk. The cost-cutting and disinvestment that eroded store experience and worker morale were choices made by managers who prioritized short-term financial metrics over long-term viability. Each of these choices seemed reasonable or even necessary at the time, but collectively they created conditions where recovery was impossible and collapse was inevitable. The legacy of JCPenney will not be the century of service to American families or the founding principles of fairness and integrity. The legacy will be the bankruptcy and the failure, the lost jobs and closed stores, the cautionary tale about what happens when financial engineering and misguided transformation destroy viable businesses. Future business school students will study the Ron Johnson disaster as an example of how not to implement change, how hubris and overconfidence can destroy companies, how importing strategies from one context to another without adaptation is catastrophic. Bankruptcy lawyers and restructuring professionals will reference the JCPenney bankruptcy as a case study in how retail bankruptcies work, how creditors position themselves, how value gets distributed in insolvency. But the deeper lessons, the ones about how we structure economic relationships and allocate risk and protect stakeholders who lack power, those lessons will probably be ignored because acknowledging them would require systemic changes that challenge fundamental assumptions about how capitalism should work. What remains in the abandoned JCPenney stores and struggling locations that still operate is evidence of a particular moment in American commercial history, of how we once organized retail and consumption, of what we lost in the transformation to e-commerce and what we maybe gained and whether the trade-offs were worth the costs to the people and communities that bore them. These spaces don't inspire the same fascination as abandoned factories or grand department stores in major cities. They're just empty retail boxes in dying malls, forgettable spaces that were never beautiful, utilitarian architecture that served a function and no longer does. But they represent something real about American life, about how millions of people worked and shopped and built communities, about what happens when business models that sustain that way of life become obsolete and nothing adequately replaces them. The fluorescent light that once illuminated racks of affordable clothing now shines on empty space, unchanging and indifferent. The same light that greeted generations of shoppers and workers now illuminating absence, promising nothing, delivering exactly what it promises.